Hello friends, I'm Rahul. This is HOA Revenge Lab, where every HOA story has drama, tension, and justice. At exactly 6:12 on a freezing Monday morning, the residents of Blackwater Ridge woke up to a problem they never imagined could exist. The bridge was closed, not temporarily, not for repairs, completely locked down with steel barricades, warning signs, floodlights, and one giant notice that changed the entire future of their luxury HOA community. The part that made this story unbelievable wasn't the closure itself, it was the signature at the bottom of the notice. Because the man who owned the bridge wasn't the county, wasn't the city, wasn't the HOA, it was the same quiet landowner the HOA board had spent 3 straight years harassing, like he was some unwanted trespasser, living beyond their perfect neighborhood gates. Bro, when I first heard this story, I genuinely thought there was no way it could be real, but the deeper this situation went, the crazier it became. And trust me, by the end of this story, the revenge becomes absolutely unbelievable. 2-3 years earlier, Blackwater Ridge had been advertised as the crown jewel of mountain luxury living. The developers promised private lake access, panoramic forest views, custom-built estates, hiking trails, and complete isolation from the noise of nearby cities. Every brochure looked like something out of a billionaire lifestyle magazine. Massive stone entrances, perfectly paved roads, decorative waterfalls near the security gates. Even the streetlights looked expensive. And honestly, that's usually the first red flag with stories like this. Because the more obsessed a neighborhood becomes with appearances, the uglier the people behind the scenes usually are. The community sat deep inside a remote valley surrounded by thick pine forest and elevated ridgelines. To most buyers, the location looked peaceful and exclusive, but there was one detail hidden deep inside the county property. Maps that almost nobody paid attention to during the purchasing process. Blackwater Ridge only had one legal road entrance, and that entrance crossed a narrow concrete bridge running through a section of privately owned land. That land belonged to a man named Grant Mercer. Now, Grant wasn't the type of guy HOA boards usually knew how to handle. He wasn't loud, wasn't reckless, didn't act aggressive. In fact, most people in the county barely saw him. He was in his late 50s, former infrastructure contractor, financially independent, and living alone on nearly 6,000 acres of undeveloped mountain property his family had accumulated over generations. The Mercer land stretched across forests, rivers, ridges, and open grazing fields surrounding almost the entire eastern side of the valley. Most importantly, the bridge leading to Blackwater Ridge sat entirely on Mercer property. And somehow, the HOA never thought that mattered. 3. C. The original developers had signed a temporary infrastructure easement with Grant nearly 15 years earlier, while construction crews were building the neighborhood. At the time, the agreement looked simple. The developers needed access for utility trucks, concrete mixers, and emergency vehicles while county road approvals were still pending. Grant allowed temporary use under specific conditions because the developers promised the county would and eventually build a permanent public access road on the western side of the valley. That road was never built. Then the housing market exploded, property values skyrocketed. More mansions appeared, more investors arrived, and somewhere along the line, the temporary access agreement quietly became the permanent reality for hundreds of wealthy homeowners. Nobody questioned it because everything worked smoothly for years. Residents crossed the bridge daily without thinking about ownership. Delivery trucks used it. School buses crossed it. Emergency responders crossed it. Even utility companies treated it like public infrastructure. But legally, it never was. And that little detail eventually became the HOA's worst nightmare. At first, Grant stayed completely out of everyone's business. He rarely interacted with residents. He maintained his own property, roads, paid his taxes, kept to himself. Occasionally, people spotted him driving an old diesel truck through the valley or repairing fencing near the riverbanks. Most residents barely knew his name. But then Blackwater Ridge elected a brand new HOA president named Celia Voss. And everything changed. Bro, hearing about this woman honestly made my blood pressure rise. 4. Celia had moved into Blackwater Ridge after selling a luxury real estate company in Scottsdale. She immediately became obsessed with protecting property values, and if you've heard enough HOA stories, You already know exactly what kind of person that usually becomes. Within months, she transformed the HOA board into a full-time enforcement machine. New fines appeared weekly. Residents got violation notices for trash bins visible from sidewalks. One homeowner received a warning because his mailbox color was slightly inconsistent with approved neighborhood pallets. Another got fined because guests parked overnight. During Thanksgiving, the community Facebook groups became absolute war zones. But Celia's biggest obsession wasn't inside the neighborhood, it was Grant Mercer. From her perspective, Grant's undeveloped land ruined the luxury image of Blackwater Ridge. She hated the sight of old equipment near his barns, hated his gravel maintenance roads, hated his fencing, hated seeing utility trailers parked on acreage nobody else could control. According to several residents later interviewed by local reporters, Celia repeatedly referred to Grant's property as a visual infection around premium real estate. That alone tells you exactly the type of person we're dealing with here, and the harassment started small. HOA representatives began sending Grant letters claiming his equipment created negative aesthetic influence, visible from neighborhood walking trails. Then came accusations about noise, disturbances from ranch vehicles, and then complaints about controlled burns during wildfire season despite county approval, and then demands for landscaping buffers near HOA property lines. Grant ignored almost all of it. Legally, the HOA had zero authority over his land. That should have ended the story right there. But people like Celia never stop when they hear the word no. And instead, the HOA escalated. 5 private inspectors started appearing near Grant's property entrances, photographing machinery and documenting fence conditions. Security patrols began following his workers near the bridge access roads. At one point, the HOA even attempted to petition the county to classify sections of Mercer land as public use environmental pathways, which could have dramatically reduced his development rights. And this is where things started getting personal, because Grant finally responded, not publicly, not emotionally, not dramatically. He responded with paperwork. County filings suddenly appeared challenging portions of the HOA's infrastructure compliance records. Easement documentation requests started surfacing. Historical access agreements got reviewed. Environmental drainage permits connected to Blackwater Ridge came under examination. Quietly and methodically, Grant began digging through every legal corner of the neighborhood's existence. Nobody on the HOA board seemed concerned at first. Big mistake. See, wealthy HOA boards often assume money automatically equals power, but old landowners operate differently, especially people who spent decades dealing with contractors, county governments, utility negotiations, and infrastructure law. Grant understood something the HOA didn't. The entire neighborhood depended on assumptions nobody had legally verified in years. And assumptions are dangerous. One winter, severe storms damaged retaining walls near the bridge approach. Grant temporarily restricted heavy vehicle access while structural engineers inspected erosion beneath the supports. The HOA absolutely exploded over it. Residents complained online for weeks because delivery routes became delayed and contractors had to reduce equipment loads. Celia took that personally. 6. Instead of cooperating, she organized an emergency HOA meeting where she accused Grant of holding the community hostage. According to several residents who attended, she openly discussed pursuing aggressive legal action to seize permanent access rights through county intervention. Bro, that's the exact moment this entire situation crossed into insanity. Because threatening someone over property access only works if your legal position is solid, and theirs absolutely wasn't so. Grant attended that meeting quietly, didn't argue, didn't interrupt, didn't raise his voice once. He simply sat in the back corner listening while board members talked about him like he wasn't even there. Then, near the end of the meeting, he stood up, handed the HOA attorney a thin folder, and walked out without saying another word. At first, nobody understood what had happened. Then the lawyers started reading. Inside the folder were copies of the original easement agreements, expired agreements, temporary agreements, conditional agreements, and most importantly, documentation showing multiple clauses had never been renewed after the original development company dissolved years earlier. The room reportedly went silent because suddenly the HOA realized something horrifying. Their entire community access route might legally exist only because Grant had allowed it voluntarily all these years, not because they actually possessed permanent rights. And that realization triggered absolute panic behind closed doors. Over the next several months, HOA attorneys scrambled to stabilize the situation. Emergency consultations happened constantly. Private meetings with county officials increased. Residents started noticing survey crews near the bridge and roadways. Rumors spread across the neighborhood about possible lawsuits, land disputes, and infrastructure problems. But Celia refused to back down. In fact, she doubled down harder than ever. 7. The HOA began issuing public statements implying Grant's property created safety concerns. Anonymous complaints suddenly appeared with environmental agencies. County inspectors started visiting Mercer land, repeatedly over drainage runoff accusations. Someone even leaked rumors online suggesting Grant planned to sell acreage to commercial developers for industrial projects. The tension became toxic. And honestly, this is the part where normal people would have tried finding compromise, not Celia, because she genuinely believed the HOA could intimidate Grant into surrendering permanent access rights. What she didn't realize was that Grant had already started preparing for war. And unlike the HOA board, he'd been preparing quietly for almost 2 years. By the time Blackwater Ridge finally understood what was happening, it was already too late. Because the bridge they crossed every single day, the bridge they treated like public property, the bridge they assumed nobody could ever touch. Grant Mercer had spent months rebuilding its legal status from the ground up, and one freezing Monday morning, he finally decided to close it. The first thing residents noticed Monday morning wasn't the barricades, it was the silence. Normally, Blackwater Ridge woke up in layers. Luxury SUVs warming inside oversized garages, delivery trucks rolling through security gates before sunrise, joggers moving along decorative stone pathways while landscapers prepared the common areas. But that morning, something felt wrong the second people reached the eastern access road leading toward the bridge. Traffic had stopped completely. 8 rows of expensive vehicles sat trapped in freezing fog while headlights reflected against massive steel barriers installed directly across the bridge entrance overnight. Portable floodlights, illuminated concrete barricades, orange warning signs, and temporary fencing stretching from guardrail to guardrail. Security personnel in reflective jackets stood beside utility trucks, while county deputies monitored the road from a distance. And right in the center of the blockade stood a giant white sign, "Private access suspended pending structural liability review," authorized by property owner Grant Mercer. Bro, imagine spending $2 million on a luxury home only to wake up and realize your entire neighborhood basically depended on one man's patience the whole time. That's the kind of situation that instantly turns rich, suburban confidence into pure panic. Within an hour, Blackwater Ridge completely melted down. Residents flooded HOA social media pages demanding answers. Some assumed it was a temporary construction issue, others believed it had to be illegal. A few homeowners actually tried moving the barriers themselves before deputies warned them away from the restricted area. School buses turned around, and contractors got stranded outside the valley. Deliveries stopped immediately. And then the real nightmare became obvious. Emergency access was compromised too. Now, technically, emergency responders still had limited conditional passage under temporary coordination procedures Grant established with county authorities. But response times dramatically increased because heavy equipment and normal traffic patterns were now restricted under weight control protocols. Ambulances had to coordinate crossings manually. Fire response routes became slower, and utility maintenance crews required authorization. And suddenly, Blackwater Ridge didn't feel like an elite private community anymore. It felt isolated. Celia Boss lost her mind almost instantly. 9, according to several residents later interviewed online, she arrived at the bridge personally before sunrise, wearing designer winter boots and screaming at county officials in the middle of the road while dozens of homeowners watched from their vehicles. But the problem was simple. Nobody there had authority to reopen anything because legally, Grant owned the bridge. Not the HOA, not the county, him. And this is where the situation became absolutely incredible, because while residents panicked publicly, Grant remained completely calm. In fact, several locals later said they saw him sitting on the porch of his ranch house that same morning drinking coffee, while traffic chaos unfolded nearly a mile away. That image alone honestly feels cinematic. Years of harassment, years of threats, years of HOA pressure campaigns. And now the same people who treated him like an inconvenience suddenly realized their entire lifestyle depended on his cooperation. The HOA immediately called emergency legal meetings. Attorneys rushed into damage control mode, trying to argue the bridge closure violated implied public access expectations. But Grant's legal team had already anticipated every possible angle months earlier. Structural engineering reports documented erosion concerns beneath support foundations, and liability assessments referenced increasing heavy vehicle traffic from neighborhood expansion. Insurance carriers had apparently raised concerns about unrestricted access exposure. Everything was documented, everything was organized, everything was ready, and that terrified the HOA even more, because this no longer looked emotional, it looked planned. Over the next 48 hours, Blackwater Ridge transformed into absolute chaos. Residents who normally obsessed over landscaping complaints and pool maintenance suddenly faced real-world infrastructure. Problems nobody had prepared for. Grocery deliveries became unreliable, contractors canceled renovation schedules, home health care workers struggled, reaching elderly residents. Parents complained about extended school transportation. Routes, even worse, property values started taking immediate hits. Real estate agents quietly began warning sellers not to mention the bridge situation during private showings. Potential buyers researching the neighborhood discovered ongoing access disputes online. Rumors exploded across local community forums claiming Blackwater Ridge might become tied up in litigation for years. And honestly, once wealthy communities smell financial instability, people turn on each other fast. Very fast. Residents started blaming the HOA board publicly. At first, Celia tried controlling the narrative. She released aggressive statements claiming Grant was acting irrationally and abusing temporary authority while legal action was underway. But that strategy collapsed almost immediately once county property records started circulating online, because residents finally saw the truth themselves. The bridge had never officially transferred into public ownership. Not once. For years, homeowners had unknowingly purchased luxury properties dependent on a privately controlled infrastructure route governed by outdated development agreements. That realization hit like a bomb. People became furious, especially longtime residents who suddenly understood the HOA either ignored the issue completely or deliberately concealed it while continuing expansion projects and collecting massive association fees. And 11, one resident reportedly stood during an emergency HOA meeting and demanded to know how the board approved millions in neighborhood upgrades without securing permanent legal access first. Another accused the HOA leadership of running a luxury resort on borrowed property rights. And honestly, that description was pretty accurate. Meanwhile, Grant still wasn't speaking publicly. That drove everyone insane because people expected shouting, lawsuits, public threats, interviews, drama. Instead, Grant communicated almost entirely through formal notices and legal filings. It made the situation feel even more dangerous because there was no emotional chaos to exploit. No public meltdown, no reckless statements, just calm pressure. That kind of silence scares people more than anger sometimes, especially controlling people like Celia. Within days, the HOA launched its first major counterattack. They filed emergency motions seeking temporary court intervention, forcing the bridge to reopen under critical residential necessity. Their attorneys argued hundreds of families relied on the access route for basic transportation and emergency services. They also attempted portraying Grant as retaliatory and unreasonable. But there was one gigantic problem. Grant's lawyers produced years of documentation showing repeated HOA hostility toward him and his property rights. Every complaint, every enforcement attempt, every county petition, every recorded meeting. Bro, this part genuinely blew my mind. Grant had apparently archived everything for years: emails, letters, inspection records, photographs, board meeting transcripts, even social media posts from HOA leadership discussing strategies against him. The amount of preparation was honestly terrifying, and when those records reached court discussions, the narrative shifted instantly. Now, the HOA no longer looked like innocent homeowners trapped by a reckless landowner. 12. They looked like aggressive neighbors who spent years antagonizing the exact person controlling their only access point. Massive difference. The county government quietly started distancing itself, too. Officials didn't want involvement in a private infrastructure war tied to questionable development oversight, especially once investigators discovered multiple recommendations for alternative public access studies had been ignored years earlier because developers considered additional roads too expensive and environmentally disruptive. In other words, Blackwater Ridge created this vulnerability intentionally to maximize profits, and now everyone was paying for it. And then things escalated even further because 1 week after the bridge closure, Grant announced additional restrictions. Heavy commercial vehicles would no longer receive routine passage approvals until structural reinforcement assessments finished completely. That single decision crippled ongoing construction projects throughout Blackwater Ridge. Luxury home expansions stopped overnight, concrete deliveries halted, and landscaping projects froze. Pool installations paused mid-construction. Entire crews got stranded outside the valley, unable to transport equipment across the bridge safely under new weight restrictions. Millions of dollars in projects instantly stalled. Residents absolutely exploded with rage. Not at Grant anymore, at the HOA. People started demanding resignations publicly, and emergency meetings became screaming matches. Homeowners accused board members of negligence, arrogance, and financial incompetence. Some residents even hired independent attorneys investigating whether the HOA failed fiduciary responsibilities by never securing permanent infrastructure rights. And through all of it, Celia still refused to admit defeat. In fact, she became even more obsessed with destroying Grant. 13. According to later testimony from a former HOA board member, Celia privately believed Grant was bluffing and eventually would reopen everything under financial pressure. She assumed maintaining the closure long term would become too expensive and politically difficult. But what she didn't understand was simple. Grant wasn't protecting money anymore. He was protecting principle. And people fighting for principle are way harder to predict than people fighting for profit. Then came the discovery that changed the entire war completely. Because during legal research into old county development records, investigators uncovered something very deep inside forgotten infrastructure filings from nearly 2 decades earlier. And something the HOA should have feared from the very beginning. Grant Mercer didn't just own the bridge, he also owned the underlying utility corridor running beneath it. And the second residents realized what that meant. True panic finally began spreading through Blackwater Ridge. The utility corridor discovery hit Blackwater Ridge like an earthquake. At first, most residents didn't fully understand why lawyers suddenly looked terrified during emergency HOA meetings. People heard phrases like infrastructure dependency, private utility easements, and service continuity exposure. But the average homeowner still assumed this was mainly about road access. It wasn't. The bridge had only been the beginning, because buried underneath the bridge structure and extending across sections of Mercer land were the primary utility lines supporting nearly the entire eastern side of Blackwater Ridge. Water routing systems, fiber communication lines, electrical conduits, maintenance access channels, everything had originally been installed during the development boom under temporary cooperative agreements. Nobody properly updated after the original builder dissolved. Bro, hearing that part genuinely made me pause. 14. Imagine buying a luxury property, believing you own stability, security, and long-term infrastructure, only to discover the foundation of your entire neighborhood operates on decades-old handshake, politics, and expired paperwork. That's insane. And the HOA board knew immediately how dangerous this had become. Because now the problem wasn't just inconvenience. It was leverage, massive leverage. The moment residents learned the utilities crossed Mercer property, the atmosphere inside Blackwater Ridge changed completely. The panic became personal. Suddenly, homeowners weren't worried about delayed Amazon deliveries anymore. They started imagining frozen water access, unstable electrical servicing, internet outages, insurance complications, and mortgage valuation collapses. Fear spread fast, especially among wealthy communities where image and stability are basically treated like oxygen. The HOA attempted damage control immediately. Celia organized a closed-door community reassurance briefing at the clubhouse ballroom, trying to calm residents before rumors got worse. But, according to multiple people who attended, the meeting became a complete disaster within minutes because residents arrived angry, really angry. One homeowner reportedly demanded to know how the HOA collected millions in fees while failing to secure permanent infrastructure agreements. Another accused the board of behaving like wannabe dictators who never bothered reading legal documents. A retired attorney living in the neighborhood allegedly stood up and bluntly explained that the HOA's entire negotiating position now looked catastrophically weak. And honestly, he wasn't wrong, because every day the conflict continued. Grant's position got stronger, not weaker. 15. The county still refused direct intervention because technically no laws had been broken. Structural liability concerns provided legitimate justification for restricted access. Utility systems remained operational. Emergency coordination still existed. Nothing legally forced Grant to maintain unrestricted convenience for a private luxury development built around temporary agreements. That reality drove residents absolutely crazy. People hate discovering comfort was conditional the whole time, especially rich people. And then local media got involved, and this is where the story exploded beyond Blackwater Ridge entirely. Regional news stations started covering the private bridge war after drone footage showed miles of backed up traffic outside the community entrance during morning commute hours. Online articles highlighted the bizarre legal battle between a luxury HOA and the quiet ranch owner controlling their only access route. Social media users instantly sided against the HOA after reports surfaced about years of harassment campaigns targeting Grant. The internet absolutely devoured the story. Bro, people online love HOA revenge stories. The second audiences hear about entitled neighborhood boards getting humble, they turn into full-time investigators overnight. Old meeting screenshots surfaced online. Residents leaked internal HOA emails. People discovered archived complaints against Grant over things as ridiculous as improper visual harmony with neighborhood landscaping themes. That phrase alone sounds like parody. But apparently it was real, and once the public saw how aggressively the HOA had targeted Grant for years, sympathy for Blackwater Ridge disappeared almost overnight. Meanwhile, Grant still remained silent publicly. No interviews, no emotional statements, and no social media posts, nothing. That silence started haunting the HOA leadership psychologically because they couldn't predict his endgame anymore. 16, was he trying to force a settlement? Planning a lawsuit? Preparing to sell access rights? Nobody knew, and uncertainty became its own weapon. And then another major problem surfaced. Insurance companies started paying attention. Several homeowners reportedly received notices from insurers requesting clarification regarding emergency access reliability and infrastructure disputes affecting the neighborhood. Some policies entered review status. A few high-value property transactions paused entirely pending legal evaluations. That's when the financial bleeding truly began. See, wealthy communities survive on perception. The second uncertainty enters the market, everything slows down. Buyers hesitate, lenders become cautious, contractors back away, investors disappeared. Blackwater Ridge started feeling toxic, and residents blamed the HOA more every single day. But Celia, she became even more dangerous under pressure. Instead of de-escalating, she launched a private investigation campaign targeting Grant personally. Former contractors, county workers, and even neighboring landowners later described receiving calls from HOA representatives asking questions about Mercer finances, property taxes, environmental compliance history, and possible business vulnerabilities. Bro, this woman genuinely could not accept losing. And honestly, that personality trait is what destroyed everything. Because while Celia focused on hurting Grant emotionally, Grant focused on dismantling the HOA structurally. Huge difference. One evening, residents noticed survey crews returning near the bridge again, but this time they weren't county officials. They were private engineering teams hired by Mercer Holdings, the land management company overseeing Grant's acreage. Rumors spread instantly. Then came the announcement. Grant intended to begin a comprehensive redevelopment and conservation transition project across major sections of his property. 17, that wording sounded harmless at first, until people read the details. New private access gates, restricted commercial transit corridors, and land rehabilitation zones, and environmental preservation sectors, controlled infrastructure modernization, and most importantly, future access subject to revised contractual compliance standards. In simple terms, Grant was restructuring the entire property surrounding Blackwater Ridge, legally, permanently, and suddenly residents realized something horrifying. Even if the HOA eventually reopened the bridge fully, Grant could still impose entirely new operational conditions across his land moving forward. The balance of power had completely shifted. The HOA no longer looked dominant. They looked trapped. Then came the helicopter incident. This part honestly feels like something straight out of a movie. One wealthy resident, furious about bridge delays affecting his business travel schedule, attempted bypassing access restrictions by arranging private helicopter transportation from a temporary landing zone near the community golf course. Videos of the aircraft landing inside Blackwater Ridge spread across social media instantly. And that single stunt accidentally exposed how desperate residents had become. Within days, more homeowners explored alternative transportation plans. Temporary shuttle services appeared. Some residents rented nearby apartments outside the valley to avoid commute delays. Others simply left their homes entirely for extended periods. Blackwater Ridge slowly started feeling abandoned. Not physically, psychologically. The illusion of exclusivity had shattered because true luxury depends on stability, and stability was gone. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, something even worse was happening for the HOA. Former board members started cooperating with investigators and attorneys independently. 18C. Once financial liability enters the picture, loyalty disappears fast. People who once defended Celia suddenly wanted distance from every decision connected to the bridge dispute. Internal communications leaked, showing repeated warnings from legal consultants years earlier recommending permanent easement negotiations with Grant before expanding the neighborhood further. Those warnings were ignored. Why? Because securing permanent infrastructure rights would have cost millions. So developers and later HOA leadership simply gambled that Grant would never challenge the arrangement seriously. That gamble became catastrophic. And then came the discovery that pushed the entire situation into full-scale war. During infrastructure reviews, engineers found evidence that several unauthorized modifications had been made over the years to utility routing systems crossing Mercer land. Without formal approval, without updated agreements, without proper authorization. Bro, when that information surfaced, it changed everything. Because now the dispute wasn't just about expired permissions anymore. Now there were potential liability violations tied directly to private property usage. Grant's legal team reacted immediately. Formal notices went out demanding immediate compliance audits across all utility interfaces connected to Mercer land. The language inside those filings reportedly terrified HOA attorneys because it opened possibilities for enormous financial exposure if unauthorized infrastructure expansions had occurred beyond original easement allowances. Residents started hearing words like retroactive liability, and once homeowners hear phrases like that, pure panic begins. Emergency HOA meetings stretched past midnight almost daily. Financial consultants got hired, crisis management firms entered the picture, public relations teams attempted reshaping media narratives. None of it worked because the core reality never changed. 19. The HOA had spent years treating Grant Mercer like an obstacle, Now they were discovering he had quietly become the single most powerful person in the entire valley. And the worst part, he still hadn't fully retaliated yet, because while Blackwater Ridge focused entirely on surviving the present crisis, Grant was already preparing the move that would completely break the HOA forever. By the beginning of winter, Blackwater Ridge no longer resembled the luxury dream community shown in real estate brochures. The fountains near the entrance still ran, the stone gates still looked expensive, the clubhouse still hosted wine nights and yoga mornings, but underneath the polished surface, the neighborhood was collapsing into paranoia. And honestly, this part of the story is where the revenge becomes absolutely brutal. Because Grant Mercer finally stopped playing defense. For months, the HOA believed they were trapped in a temporary legal dispute that eventually could be negotiated away with pressure, money, or political influence, even after the bridge closure, even after the utility corridor discovery, even after the public backlash. Deep down, Celia still believed Blackwater Ridge would regain control eventually. And then Grant made one announcement, and the entire community went into survival mode. It happened during a county land use hearing most residents didn't even know was taking place. The meeting itself looked routine at first. Agricultural zoning reviews, water management discussions, conservation proposals, boring government paperwork most people never pay attention to, but buried halfway through the agenda sat one item connected to Mercer Holdings. Private Infrastructure, Redevelopment and Controlled Access Transition Plan. That harmless title concealed a financial nuclear bomb. 20 because Grant officially proposed converting major sections of his land surrounding the Eastern Valley into a protected private conservation and agricultural district under revised transportation restrictions. The proposal included new gated transit checkpoints, commercial traffic limitations, environmental roadway controls, and most importantly, permanent toll-based infrastructure maintenance systems for non-owner access usage. In simple words, Blackwater Ridge residents would potentially have to pay Grant every single time they crossed his property. So, bro, the second that proposal became public, people absolutely lost their minds. Residents flooded county offices with complaints. HOA attorneys filed emergency objections within hours. Community Facebook groups became unreadable war zones full of panic, accusations, and conspiracy theories. Some homeowners genuinely believed Grant was trying to bankrupt the neighborhood intentionally, but here's the part that made the entire situation incredible. Legally, he might actually have been allowed to do it. That realization changed the emotional atmosphere completely. Up until that moment, most residents still assumed somebody higher up would eventually fix the problem. Maybe the county would intervene. Maybe courts would step in. Maybe state transportation agencies would force public access protections. But the more legal experts reviewed the case publicly, the uglier the truth became. Blackwater Ridge existed because of historical convenience, not guaranteed control, and convenience can disappear overnight. The county hearings drew massive crowds after local media picked up the story again. Reporters called it the Millionaire Bridge Standoff. Drone footage of luxury SUVs lining up outside restricted access points circulated online constantly. Internet commentators mocked the HOA relentlessly, especially after old enforcement letters targeting Grant resurfaced again. 21 viral posts showed a complaint accusing Grant's ranch fencing of creating visual discomfort for upscale property aesthetics. People online absolutely destroyed them for that, and honestly, deserved. Meanwhile, Grant still maintained the same calm silence that had driven the HOA insane for months. He attended hearings quietly, sat through legal reviews without reacting emotionally. Sometimes he appeared wearing old work jackets while surrounded by wealthy residents in designer clothing, screaming about property values and inconvenience. That contrast became symbolic. The quiet landowner versus the entitled neighborhood. And public opinion overwhelmingly sided with Grant. But behind closed doors, Blackwater Ridge faced a much darker reality than embarrassment. Financial collapse was beginning, home sales froze almost completely, several pending luxury property deals died during contract review stages once buyers discovered the infrastructure dispute. Real estate agents privately warned clients to avoid long-term commitments inside the valley until legal stability returned. Mortgage lenders started demanding additional disclosures tied to access, reliability, and easement uncertainty. Some homeowners reportedly lost hundreds of thousands in valuation estimates within weeks. And that pressure turned neighbor against neighbor fast. Residents who originally supported Celia now blamed her openly for escalating the conflict. Emergency HOA meetings became vicious. Homeowners shouted over each other. Lawyers interrupted constantly. Financial consultants presented worst-case projections showing catastrophic reserve losses if litigation continued long-term. One projection estimated the HOA might eventually need special assessment fees exceeding 6 figures per household to fund infrastructure litigation and alternative access developments. 22, bro. Imagine paying luxury HOA fees for years only to suddenly hear you might owe another $100,000 because your board picked a fight with the wrong guy. That's nightmare fuel. But Celia still refused surrender. In fact, she became more reckless than ever. According to later testimony from multiple former board members, Celia secretly believed public pressure would eventually force Grant into compromise if they could portray him as harming families and emergency services intentionally. So the HOA launched a massive public relations campaign, and it backfired spectacularly. Commercials appeared online accusing Grant of isolating residents unfairly. Community petitions described Blackwater Ridge homeowners as victims of private land retaliation. Media interviews framed the HOA as ordinary families trapped by one stubborn ranch owner. The problem, the internet already knew the history. People immediately dug up years of HOA harassment records again, old complaints, inspection campaigns, meeting transcripts, enforcement threats. Everything resurfaced harder than before. Instead of gaining sympathy, the HOA got humiliated publicly again, and then Grant delivered the most devastating move yet. He released documentation proving he had actually offered permanent easement negotiations years earlier, multiple times, reasonable offers, structured agreements, shared maintenance proposals, all rejected by HOA leadership because Celia and previous board members believed securing permanent rights would unnecessarily empower neighboring land interests. Bro, hearing that genuinely made my jaw drop. They could have solved the entire problem years earlier, but arrogance got in the way. That revelation shattered whatever trust residents still had in the HOA leadership. Homeowners realized this disaster wasn't time unavoidable. It wasn't random bad luck. It wasn't some unpredictable legal loophole. 23, it was ego, pure ego. The backlash became nuclear. Several board members resigned almost immediately after the documents surfaced publicly. Residents threatened lawsuits against the HOA itself. Emergency recall petitions circulated throughout the neighborhood, demanding Celia's removal. Former supporters openly accused her of destroying property values through personal obsession. But somehow, Celia still kept fighting, and that's when she made the biggest mistake of the entire story. Because desperate people stopped thinking strategically. One freezing evening during peak commuter traffic, a group connected to HOA leadership attempted bypassing Mercer restrictions by reopening part of the eastern maintenance route independently. Workers hired through a private contractor allegedly moved temporary barriers and attempted restoring unrestricted access flow without authorization. Huge mistake. Massive mistake, because Grant's security teams documented everything immediately. County deputies arrived, inspectors arrived, lawyers arrived, and within hours, the incident exploded into full legal escalation. Unauthorized interference with restricted private infrastructure is not something courts take lightly, especially during ongoing liability disputes involving engineering concerns and formal notices already filed publicly. The HOA's position became catastrophic overnight. Judges who previously viewed the conflict as complicated civil disagreement suddenly saw evidence suggesting intentional disregard for property restrictions and infrastructure authority. That changed everything. Emergency motions filed by the HOA started failing rapidly after that incident. Legal sympathy disappeared. County officials became even more cautious about associating with Blackwater Ridge leadership. Meanwhile, Grant expanded restrictions further. 24 additional transit checkpoints appeared near the bridge corridor. Commercial access windows became narrower. Infrastructure monitoring increased. Private security patrols became constant around Mercer property boundaries. And slowly, something incredible happened. The HOA realized Grant wasn't trying to win quickly, he was trying to exhaust them completely, financially, legally, psychologically. That realization terrified everyone. Because wealthy communities survive through confidence, the second people believe stability is gone permanently, panic accelerates itself. Residents started moving out temporarily, contractors demanded upfront payments before accepting. Valley projects, service providers increased rates because access delays hurt scheduling. Even holiday events inside Blackwater Ridge started feeling empty. The community spirit vanished. And through all of it, Greg remained patient, calm, methodical, like someone following a plan already finished long ago. Then rumors started spreading about a second bridge. At first, most residents dismissed it as gossip, but survey helicopters appeared near the western ridgelines. County planning records suddenly referenced transportation feasibility studies. Construction consultants were spotted near undeveloped canyon routes outside the valley. And slowly, homeowners realized something horrifying. Grant might not just be restricting access anymore. He might be building an entirely new future around the complete isolation of Blackwater Ridge. And if those rumors proved true, the HOA's nightmare was only beginning. The rumor about the second bridge stopped feeling like gossip the moment construction markers appeared across the western ridgeline. 25 bright orange survey flags stretched through sections of untouched valley terrain miles away from Blackwater Ridge, and within days, heavy equipment started moving along old logging paths most residents didn't even know existed. Drones captured footage of excavators clearing routes through rocky canyon edges while engineering crews inspected elevation points overlooking the river basin. That's when panic inside Blackwater Ridge reached levels nobody could control anymore. Because residents suddenly realized Grant Mercer wasn't reacting emotionally, he was restructuring the geography of the entire valley. Bro, that level of patience is honestly terrifying. Most people would have exploded years earlier after the amount of harassment the HOA put him through, but Grant didn't lash out emotionally. He spent years positioning himself quietly until every move became irreversible. That's what makes this revenge story feel so insane. It wasn't chaotic revenge. It was engineered revenge. And Blackwater Ridge finally understood too late that they were trapped inside a long-term plan. The HOA tried desperately to learn what the Western Construction Project actually was, but information remained limited because most of the activity occurred entirely on Mercer land. County records showed transportation feasibility applications connected to private agricultural and conservation transit modernization, but the technical language made everything sound vague, intentionally. Then one local journalist uncovered the truth. Grant wasn't building another bridge for Blackwater Ridge. He was building one to bypass them completely. That revelation detonated across the county. 26. According to leaked planning documents, Mercer Holdings intended to construct a new commercial-grade access corridor connecting western county routes directly through Mercer property toward future agricultural processing zones and conservation tourism projects. The proposed route would entirely avoid Blackwater Ridge infrastructure while redirecting regional transit flow around the HOA community permanently. And suddenly the real revenge became clear. Grant wasn't just punishing the HOA, he was making them irrelevant. That's brutal, because powerful HOA boards survive on influence, control, perceived importance. Blackwater Ridge believed its wealth made it the center of the valley, but Grant's project threatened to transform the entire regional infrastructure system without meeting them at all. Even worse, county officials loved the proposal. For years, transportation planners quietly worried about Blackwater Ridge's dependency on a single vulnerable access point. The Mercer redevelopment project offered something governments love: privately funded infrastructure improvements, solving public logistical problems without massive taxpayer expense. So while the HOA scrambled through lawsuits and PR disasters, Grant started gaining political support. That shift completely shattered Celia. Up until that moment, she still believed pressure campaigns and legal aggression could corner Grant eventually, but now county officials, engineers, and regional development advisors openly discussed Mercer's infrastructure plans like they represented the future of the valley. Meanwhile, Blackwater Ridge increasingly looked like an unstable liability zone built on arrogance and poor planning. Residents noticed immediately 27 people who once defended the HOA started distancing themselves publicly. Wealthy homeowners began selling quietly at reduced prices just to escape uncertainty. Some houses sat dark for weeks at a time because owners stopped staying there full time. Contractors removed Blackwater Ridge promotional signs from regional advertising campaigns. The community's image collapsed fast. And honestly, this part of the story feels like watching a luxury empire slowly sink underwater while everyone argues over who caused the leak. Then came the audit. Bro, this part genuinely blew my mind. Because while the HOA focused entirely on fighting Grant publicly, independent investigators hired by several homeowners had been reviewing years of association financial records privately. And what they found turned the situation from embarrassing into catastrophic. Millions of dollars in reserve allocations had apparently been redirected over time toward aesthetic expansion projects instead of infrastructure security planning. Decorative landscaping, clubhouse renovations, private event spaces, luxury gate redesigns, all while legal consultants repeatedly warned the HOA to secure permanent easement protections immediately. Those warnings were ignored. Residents exploded. Emergency meetings became absolute war zones. People screamed at board members openly. Accusations of negligence turned into accusations of corruption. Homeowners demanded forensic accounting reviews and threatened civil litigation against current and former HOA leadership personally. Several residents reportedly needed security escorts after meetings because tensions became so hostile, and through all of it, Grant kept building. The Western project accelerated rapidly through winter. More equipment arrived weekly. Temporary construction roads expanded through canyon routes. Drone footage online showed enormous steel framework sections, staged near excavation zones. 28. Every update felt like psychological warfare against Blackwater Ridge, because each visible step reminded residents that while they remained trapped in endless internal chaos, Grant was already creating the next phase of the valley's future. Without them, and then one of the most unbelievable moments of the entire story happened in May. Celia tried to negotiate privately. After years of aggression, threats, inspections, media campaigns, and legal warfare, she finally requested a confidential meeting with Grant Mercer directly. According to later accounts leaked by former HOA attorneys, the meeting took place inside a small county mediation office during a snowstorm. Residents expected compromise talks, a settlement discussions, maybe even a pathway toward restoring stable access permanently. Instead, the meeting reportedly lasted less than 40 minutes because Grant arrived with completed documentation already prepared, not negotiation drafts, final conditions. Massive difference. The proposed agreement allegedly included permanent restructuring of Blackwater Ridge transit rights under Mercer-controlled operational standards, long-term maintenance obligations paid entirely by the HOA, commercial traffic limitations, environmental oversight provisions, and mandatory legal acknowledgement of Mercer authority across key infrastructure zones. In simple terms, the HOA would survive, but only on the grant's terms forever. Bro, after everything that happened, that level of control is unbelievable. And honestly, Celia couldn't accept it. Sources later claim she walked out furious, calling the proposal humiliating and unacceptable. But the problem was obvious to everyone else in the room. Blackwater Ridge no longer had leverage at all. The HOA's legal position weakened daily. Property values continued dropping. Public support vanished. Infrastructure uncertainty remained unresolved. Residents were already threatening lawsuits. And internally, 29. Grant knew time favored him now, not them, and then winter storms arrived. Heavy storms? the kind that turn mountain roads dangerous even under normal conditions. And suddenly the bridge issue became terrifyingly real. Flooding near the eastern access corridor caused erosion concerns again, forcing additional transit slowdowns under emergency safety protocols. Vehicles backed up for hours. Supply delays worsened. Emergency routing coordination became chaotic during icy conditions. Residents panicked harder than ever because now they weren't imagining worst case scenarios anymore. They were living them. One viral video showed luxury homeowners carrying groceries through snow along restricted pedestrian crossing lanes while arguing beside stalled traffic. Another clip captured a moving truck unable to reach a multi-million-dollar property because weight restrictions prevented safe crossing during storm runoff conditions. And the internet absolutely devoured the content. Blackwater Ridge became symbolic online, a perfect example of wealthy arrogance colliding with reality. And the worst part, the story still wasn't finished, because while the HOA spiraled deeper into collapse, Grant's Western Infrastructure Project received preliminary county support approvals faster than anyone expected. Investors started showing interest in surrounding development opportunities connected to Mercer's future transportation corridor. That's when residents realized the final, horrifying truth. Grant Mercer was about to become more powerful than and Blackwater Ridge was running out of time to survive it. Bro, stories like this are honestly why HOA revenge content blows up online, because deep down, people hate watching power get abused by arrogant boards who think money automatically gives them control over everyone around them. And the craziest part, Grant Mercer never screamed, threatened, or acted reckless. He simply understood the law better than the people trying to bully him. That's what made this revenge so satisfying. Calm patience destroyed pure arrogance. Honestly, hearing this entire situation unfold felt unreal from beginning to end. If this story shocked you too, drop a comment with whose side you were on, Grant or the HOA, and subscribe for more insane Eplo revenge stories every week.